Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Law.
A recent 5-3 decision by the U.S. Supreme Court has given administrators the legal right, to censor high school student publications. Today on Public Affairs Roundtable, we'll talk about this adults-only implication for First Amendment rights of free speech and free press. Our panelists are Terry Nelson, Publications Advisor and Journalism Instructor at Yorktown High School; Louis Engelhardt, Professor Emeritus of Journalism, Director of Student Publications at Ball State University; and John Rouse, Executive Producer of Public Affairs Roundtable and a member of the Political Science faculty at Ball State. Dr. Engelhardt, do we see with this 5-3 decision a departure from what has been the practice, the standing that the Supreme Court has given to high school journalists?
Not really, because this is the first case that involved high school newspapers or publications that ever went the full distance in the Supreme Court. So this is new ground for them, essentially. However, scores of cases in lower courts, including circuit courts of appeals, have looked at high school journalists quite differently than this decision came out.
Is this, I guess the question, is this likely to change the course of or the practices of a lot of high school journalists?
I think about 15 to 20% of the high schools will announce more restrictive policies and set up prior restraint and censorship schemes to look at what the school paper is doing. Fortunately, the Supreme Court didn't direct that anybody do any such thing. Consequently, many schools will say, well, we're not going to pay any attention to that because we like our student publication being free and full of viewpoints and rough content. We relish that. So we're not going to get huffy and squash a student opinion. I think it will be more restrictive in total, but I think there will be many cases where high school journalists will continue to be free.
Aren't there some cases where, though, administrators have just not allowed high schools to have newspapers to avoid any kind of problems like this?
The problem with that is that the students will have a newspaper one way or another. It's called underground publication in some places. I think probably you'll see a great rise. Whenever there's oppressiveness or restrictions, students have enough vitality to overcome it one way or another. And with modern desktop publishing and availability and instant photocopying and all that sort of stuff, students can rack out in 24 hours of publication.
Lou, there seems to be a couple of concerns I have. First of all, what focus is there upon responsibility in this regard? And secondly, even though you have underground newspapers that come about, they're not paid for by the taxpayer. So it seems that the issue of responsibility is one we have to look at, and also one of what should the taxpayer pay for.
The way you get a responsibility is have an intelligent, competent faculty advisor who understands what journalism is and spends time teaching students what responsible journalism is. And when you do that, you have fine student papers. There are thousands of wonderful student newspapers all across the country because there are thousands of fine advisors. It's a matter of education, not restraint or censorship.
Terry Nelson, two of the subjects of the high school newspaper in question here, teen pregnancy and the effects of divorce on children, on students, seem not to be the kinds of things that is going to get a high school publication in trouble. We're not talking about invasion of privacy. We're not talking about libel. We're not talking about sedition. We're talking about issues that students probably need to discuss and air their viewpoints on.
I think it's kind of a frightening situation here. We've got a principal who is concerned about the student who's being reported on, you know, the pregnant teenager, but the teenager who gives the interview is really trying to educate the rest of us, and not to discuss something that affects all the students, you know, openly, I think is really a mistake. In this case, the Hazelwood case, the students' names were not printed, and you know, although they knew that their comments were, so I don't see the problem. Teenage pregnancy and abortion and runaways and divorced homes have always been subjects that the high school kids have been concerned about because they're directly involved. So, you know, that seems to be not too sensitive for the students, you know, which is why the paper is here.
You've been through one of the frontline battles in terms of censorship. Give us a little history of that.
Okay. It's really kind of interesting. Back when I was in high school, my high school advisor was fired for what the students had printed in the paper. And
what scandalous thing was it with that?
Well, you know, the thing that's so crazy is I don't even remember. I don't even remember the article. At that time, I was features editor. Apparently, she got some pressure from the school administration back in the 1960s, and subsequently, she left my junior year. 10 years later, when I was now a publication advisor, I thought something like this was, you know, something of the past decade, and all of a sudden I found myself in a similar situation where the principal and the superintendent thought that the purpose of a student newspaper was to help sell school programs, not to criticize them. So the administration in that case wanted to force me to force the student editors not to write anything critical or not to discuss it on the editorial page. Also, we received letters to the editor where a student may want to have his name withheld, and the principal thought it was insubordination for me not to tell him. He wanted to force me to tell him who wrote those letters. So for those two issues of student expression, I was fired in 1979 and then subsequently rehired. And I had a court case before the federal court, but we never did get that far. I was reinstated that summer.
That was settled out of court.
Settled out of court.
It is a strange situation, isn't it, Lou, that you have basically the state through the schools, those state employees certainly, set up essentially as the publisher. And isn't that what the Supreme Court essentially said, is that even though these people might represent the state, basically they're the publishers, and they have they're really the people who are responsible for the content of a student publication?
I finally got a copy of the decision, and although it uses the word publisher once in there, it really does not make this clear. In the case of college publications, they've said the state is, or the college cannot be the publisher because it cannot control the content. The word publisher is an odd word. I don't know, there are people designated as publishers. The Muncie newspapers do not have a resident publisher. They have an executive editor. The publisher for the Muncie newspapers is located in Indianapolis, which means it's rather difficult for him to check everything that goes into the paper. Of course, maybe he has you so well trained that you would never write anything that would bother him, although I doubt that. The point of publisher, what does a publisher do? In many cases, they have nothing to do with the content of a paper. That's delegated to somebody else by the corporate structure. So it's a confusing thing, just what a publisher is. Now, I think they mean, when you, in your context, that the publisher can control the content. I think that's the crux of the thing. And in effect, whether you call a school official publisher or not, the court authorized the school administrator to control the content indiscriminately. There are no ground rules of any kind, and the administrator can, under this decision, for any reason, delete material from a school paper that's put out in a class. Now, the court didn't talk about a school paper that's not put out in class, really. It did talk about a school paper that is put out as an underground paper and financed by students. It did not talk about what happens in a school situation where the school says, we believe this paper should be a forum of viewpoints and discussion. It didn't talk about that kind of school paper, even though it is put out in a class. This is a very confused decision, really.
Lou, it seems that the court is making a decision that affects high school students.
Yes.
Does this decision have anything to say or any implication for the First Amendment rights of college editors, or the issue as it would focus towards adults, in terms of adults meaning people, the regular commercial newspapers in our society? Does this decision again have any implications for them?
It has implications, but not directly. As a matter of fact, in the decision, the court said it wasn't necessary for them to discuss college publications. So there's no change in college student publications of any kind. Some irate administrator might bring a case eventually that would encourage the same 5 people to slap a restriction on the college press. So there's that kind of chilling effect of the thing, maybe. But the basis of a lot of court decisions concerning high school press is that they're children too young to be involved in free expression, and they need to be controlled and handled much differently. This stems from obscene materials primarily, but it's interesting. The court was very concerned that a 14-year-old freshman girl might read that article about pregnancy and decide pregnancy was so fine that she could go out and get pregnant. Well, you know, Otis Bowen told the High School Press Association at convention, 400 kids, please write articles about teenage pregnancy. You can do so much to help people understand that there is a problem. And you know, the Supreme Court doesn't know it, but John, do you realize 14-year-old girls can become pregnant? And of all the people in the world who should have information available to them, it should be younger girls, not older, sophisticated girls. Larry, who may vote in the next election for president?
Those people who are 18 or will be 18
on about November 1st. Yeah. That means that anybody who is 17 by November 1st, 1986 may register to vote. In other words, half of the junior class in high school, practically all of the senior class in high school, are part of the electorate. And here this decision says, don't talk about political stuff in a school paper.
Well, isn't this issue, and I want to ask Terry this, isn't this issue really more of an issue of power, and who controls power and who controls people's behavior or minds?
I definitely agree with that. I think that the Supreme Court forgot about individual freedoms and focused more on who was in charge, who was the authority. In this Hazelwood case, I think could have been avoided easily. Why didn't the principal talk and deal with the advisor and the students and discuss it, rather than to pull the advisor in, to pull the stories before the students were even aware? When the story was published, or when the paper was published, it was published without the stories, and the students, that was the first time they had found out about it. To me, it was a problem of communication, and to me the Supreme Court is saying, okay, this is the person in charge, we're going to straighten out the high schools by having an authority figure. It's just beyond me how a student can go down the hallway to a civics class or a social studies class and learn the First Amendment and hear the teachers say, you know, it's guaranteed to all U.S. citizens regardless of age or race or creed, and then walk down to the journalism room now and not feel they have the same rights. It's a very confusing issue, and a lot of my students are very upset about it and the implications.
Might the Supreme Court, Lou, be concerned about liability? It wasn't really addressed here, but if in fact a high school publication is sued because of invasion of privacy or sued because of libel, who's responsible for damages in a case like that?
No high school publication anywhere in the country has ever lost a suit for invasion of privacy.
Well, now that's beside the point. Who would be liable if they did?
They will be more liable under this system, because they tie the school administration so definitely in a consensual relationship. It's called responde superior in the law, and they will be totally responsible for everything in that paper. And if they were subject to lawsuits before, or criticism even, they'll be more so, because if they're not paying attention, oh my. And by the way, what makes you think that a school principal or people like that know very much about libel or invasion of privacy or ethics of journalism or what responsible journalism is. That's not their background.
Lou, if I can get back to the issue of freedom versus responsibility, let's say the implications for this case could go to, say, in a local community, and this is a local decision. I think that's an important point from the perspective that the question about the protection of the minority. Okay, you have a local situation where you have a local industry. Perhaps the young 17-year-old student editor gets some information about some corruption in the local industry that is really supporting the entire community, and the kid. He's a kid in the sense he's 17 years of age. He wants to report this corruption. Don't you have a real concern about the whole economic infrastructure of that community and the impact of that particular article about this kids, and this is how an adult's going to look at it. They're going to say this is a kid doing this kid's right to publish something that's going to hurt economically the entire community.
What would you do, John, with a town paper if it published it? Would it be irresponsible? The same rule should apply to the high school paper that apply to the Muncie Star. If the Muncie Star is doing its job routing out corruption, why, there's not anywhere near the problem. Responsibility, are you being responsible when you allow corruption to flourish in your community? See, you have some philosophical questions to answer there.
Yes, it's a philosophical question, but it is one of perspective, because corruption in the corruption does not necessarily mean the breaking of the law. First of all, I mean, what is immoral might not be illegal, and secondly, in terms of corruption, people are going to have different views about what precisely is corrupt. We know in this state we have rules we don't have any rules about conflict of interest. And so that's just a matter of opinion. So it seems to me that the greater implication of this decision is, does it attack local power or local power structures? And I'm asking this question again, does it have implications for getting at this kind of concern?
Ethics, of course, we have an ethics commission that is trying to revive conflict of interest rules for the state, and they're doing a pretty good job of it. I don't know, John, is it the responsibility of the press at any level to maintain the status quo? Or is it the responsibility of the press to throw the rascals out? I think, since I'm a libertarian with a small L and a believer in First Amendment rights, I believe you should throw the rascals out.
I think the responsibility the Supreme Court was addressing was the responsibility to be fair, to be complete, to be balanced. Some of the things you're talking about, yes, the press probably has an obligation to roust out these rascals who might be in government. But the Supreme Court seems to be addressing something it defined as a good article. I mean, the principals in the Hazelwood case was concerned that perhaps the story about teenage divorces or teenagers and their effect by divorced parents was that the parents' voice wasn't heard in this, that it wasn't really a fair article. Doesn't that seem to be the responsibility? And I'm not saying that's right, but that seems to be the responsibility that the court is addressing here. Whether the article was complete, whether the reporting was fair, whether the writing was good. Weren't those the issues involved here?
They said so, but those issues were developed after the fact by the principal. The first reaction was that somebody had done him dirt by letting the students publish them. There's the Terry Nelson syndrome was greatly in effect there. And after the fat was in the fire, then the principal developed other objections. And that didn't come out in the court because the students were very inadequately represented by an attorney.
Didn't you attend the arguments before the Supreme Court?
Yes, and it was a disaster as far as the students were concerned.
Why was that?
Because the attorney was totally incompetent. Now, is that libelous?
I suspect not. This guy's thrown himself into the debate.
An open forum.
Certainly.
Terry, if I can ask you, what kind of interest is there among high school kids, if I can use that terminology again, for publishing and writing newspaper articles, what kind of enthusiasm do you find in terms of what issues are they interested in?
You know, it's wonderful. If you can, through a journalism, classroom setting, let them know and encourage them to care about their world. Anything is open. Kids want to talk about what concerns them. And in the case of the Hazelwood case, apparently the principal felt like this was an adult issue or that the parents weren't fairly, recognized in the article. But it was a student newspaper. The Muncie Star, the Indianapolis paper, the New York paper, they hear the adult concerns and they hear the adult side of the story. The student newspaper is for, expressing those terms. I asked students on their semester test Friday to write down a 3-paragraph response, a reaction to the Hazelwood case, because they were very interested in it. And, the kids are really great. What if a student dies of taking drugs and the principal won't let the newspaper print the story? That principal may be, in fact, taking the lives of many students who are also using drugs. People learn from stories, and especially good ones. We all know that we have to write about the band contest and about the football games, but it's those concerns where the kids care enough and go out and get facts. I mean, they learn so much even when they don't end up even finishing the stories. Or sometimes they learn to change their viewpoint based on facts. But if we don't encourage them to go out and to take a look at any issue, they're never going to learn anything.
Doesn't this fit into what we talked about recently, John, the marketplace of ideas? That in fact, if student ideas are good, they'll survive in that marketplace. If they're bad ideas, they'll die in the competition with other ideas.
The horror of this Supreme Court decision is that they have said 20% of the population of this country cannot share in that marketplace. They have to sit quietly, tap dance, be cute, but don't think and don't express themselves, especially if they have ideas that might disturb someone. I think that's a disaster.
Now what they've said really is that you can't express yourself necessarily in a student publication that is sponsored by the school. That's what it said. It does not say that you cannot express yourself in your own publication, perhaps in the commercial publication in your community, that you don't have the right to free speech. But I agree it has put curbs on their ability to express themselves, but in a limited arena.
Well, the problem with that is that might be the only arena that they can manipulate for a while. But if that arena is taken away from them, they'll find others. You're right there. They'll find others. And boy, will that shake the high schools.
I think one thing about the courts, and especially the Supreme Court, it's been said that the Supreme Court can propose, but it cannot dispose. And so we don't know what the Supreme Court has disposed of because there's a lot of controversy about this decision. However, it seems in a sense what the court has done, if nothing else, is to raise an agenda. And the issue of concerns in society, and the agenda is being raised on programs like this one, asking questions about the issues of society like drugs and pregnancy among young children, really, the 14 years of age or whatever. So that seems to be the real long-range impact of this decision. I guess what I'm getting around to, Lou, is that there will certainly be other decisions by the Supreme Court on issues like this where it will make individual decisions about individual cases.
There'll be a lot of litigation, first of all through the lower courts and finally bubbling through the Supreme Court. And I don't know how it'll end up finally, but I believe the pendulum sweeps both ways. And the court reads the First Amendment and understands it. I believe they understand it. It takes a while for them to face up to it. But I'm not as pessimistic as some people might be about the whole thing, because the high school advisors, journalists, with a few exceptions, will fight to restore freedom of the press to the high school level, and that will come about. So don't give up, John.
The question that we addressed earlier of liability, though, Lou, you said something that really could have a chilling effect on the student press at the high school level anyway, that this decision seems to say, okay, we'll tell you who is liable financially if there are damages, and it is the people who are responsible for publishing this newspaper, and it is the administrators, or the school board in this case. Doesn't this pretty much, I mean, isn't there the possibility, like you say, that they're going to have to be more careful about this, that perhaps they'll be harsher in how they view what is written?
That's no change. That's been true for a long while, so I don't see that this is all that significant. Listen, Larry, I'll buy you a steak dinner if you can find me 20 libel cases that high school newspapers have lost in the courts. Libel is not a serious problem with high school publications. Invasion of privacy is not a legal problem. I don't know what all the fuss is about. It's all theoretical fear on the part of somebody, and it's not worthy of Byron White to even bring up such subjects, because they're not factual reports or understandings on the part of the Supreme Court.
It's not a problem that exists now, anyway.
Not a problem that's existed in
and
the
no
history of the
indication
country.
it's going to be.
No.
Well, I'm still concerned about the minority. I mean, say if you have one student who is opposed to the editorial policy of the paper, of the high school paper or the college paper, and he goes to his parents, and then the parent says, well, you have to go to the publisher, son. But yet it's very difficult to pinpoint, it seems to me, as to who the publisher is, say, of the Ball State paper, which is a public sector state college paper.
Well, let's not talk about college, because the courts would handle that quite differently than high school.
Okay, but again, in terms of the minority, Terry, if a student opposed the current policy, how would that student try to get his or her perspective into the mainstream?
Well, see, that's the wonderful thing about encouraging a free press on a student level, is that if a student comes in and he's very concerned about editorial policy or a story that's run, he's encouraged to write his own letter to the editor and to have his viewpoint in the newspaper too. I think encouraging debate, on issues is wonderful. It gives people a chance to air their opinions, pros and cons. It gives the readers a chance to see both sides and to make an intelligent decision. And just because someone happens to be, 10 years younger or 20 years younger than a reporter doesn't mean that they don't have cares and concerns, on issues that affect them. So I think it's a wonderful place, and if a student does disagree, he may be able to make a point about that editorial policy that maybe the editorial policy is wrong.
Yeah, I must admit that my favorite part of the paper oftentimes is that section where you have letters to the editor, and of course I've had disagreements as to whether the name should be in there. I would think that a name should be in there, because what it does is to give responsibility to the person who's making the comment.
Well, the court didn't take up that issue. So
well, I'm responsible here for cutting this program off when we're out of time, which we are right now. Thanks to our panelists Lou Englehart, Terry Nelson, and John Rouse for their comments and experiences here today. I'm Larry Law. Thank you for being with us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana, 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Mike Seaborg, Bill Mosier, Nancy Carlson, and Steve Johnson. This program is a production of University Media Services and the Department of Political Science. Facilities and funding are provided by University Media Services on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.